to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built a town.
That is, of course, the crooning voice of Bing Crosby. And we are talking about the Great Depression. For those of you that have relatives, perhaps grandparents or living great-grandparents, who lived during the Depression, you will notice a couple of things about them. Actually, several things about them. And perhaps the most notable is their penchant for not throwing away a single thing. Making do with what you have. Eating everything on your plate. And so forth. That is the sign of someone who existed through the Great Depression. A time in which the entire financial situation of the world came to a screeching halt, and in many places came to a catastrophic end. A time that so racked the world economy that people throughout the globe, and in countries in particular, began to look for, shall we say, rather extreme solutions, or at least look to people who offered very extreme solutions. In looking at the Great Depression, let's take a look first at U.S. diplomacy between 1921 and 1929, which had a marked effect on the domestic policies of the United States, especially in regards to economics. Then we'll see the end of prosperity, then Hoover and the Depression, and then the response to the Depression. And there are two quintessential pictures of the Great Depression. Men, hard-working men, waiting in line for free soup and bread, and vagrant migrant workers going from town to town looking for work, and the signs of the town saying, "Jobless men keep going, we can't take care of our own." In the picture you see there, Aristide Briand and Frank Kellogg signed with Calvin Coolidge looking on. And in this picture you see U.S. Secretary of the Navy Curtis Wilbur with a young up-and-coming Japanese officer by the name of Yamamoto Isoroku. In a collegial moment of two naval men, Yamamoto is the man, of course, who will orchestrate the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now let's take a look at the end of prosperity. The worst economic disaster in the entire world began on October the 29th, 1929. Why did the Depression happen? A variety of factors. I'm no economist, but I do know a little bit of the history of this. It was an overextension of credit. It was overproduction in the industrial base of the United States. There was a poor distribution of wealth and income, which is always a precursor to an economic downturn. There was an economic slowdown, which I just said, and very irresponsible risks taken by banks and other financial institutions. The lure of wealth was simply too much for the banks to resist, and the banks were not regulated nearly enough. And thus came Black Tuesday of 1929. Now, it's very important to understand that the crash, the Great Depression that followed, happened during the administration of Herbert Hoover. There is actually a strain of conservative thought that attempts to place the Great Depression on the shoulders of Franklin Roosevelt. That is patently false. It is untrue. There was a recession during Roosevelt's administration, but the first downturn began during the Hoover administration. On October the 29th, 1929, the Dow Jones, which at the time was at an all-time high of 469, now it's over 20,000, dropped to 221. And the Depression began after that. Massive layoffs and unemployment. Wage freezes for those who remained in work. Massive bank failures. Worldwide in scope was this depression, and the decline in world trade soon followed afterwards. And there was a limited supply of money in the country. It means that today, if we have a problem like this, the Federal Reserve usually sends more money into circulation, as it did in 2009 to avoid another depression. The government did not do it back then because, and one of the reasons for this was those four bankers from Germany, France, the United States, and England had all put us on the gold standard again. And at the time this happened, you had a president in Herbert Hoover who did not believe that the government should be, in any way, shape, or form, taking steps to ameliorate the problem. And yet, after time, as things got worse, everybody kept saying, let it be, laissez-faire, things will get better. But they got worse, and they got worse. And finally, Hoover begins to act, but it's too little too late. He signs into law the Glass-Steagall Act, which separates banks into investment banks and simple financial banks. Many people are trying to roll back today Glass-Steagall, as if the lessons of the past now are vanishing. Hoover also puts into effect the Federal Home Loan Bank Act to spur production. They also put in a tariff, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, to protect American manufacturers. But tariffs usually result in retaliatory tariffs by other nations, and so trade was declining. There was some public works, building of the Boulder Dam on the Colorado River near where Las Vegas is today. Later becomes known as the Hoover Dam and creates Lake Mead. He creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to try and see if we can update the nation's infrastructure. Many of what Hoover tried to do, many of the programs that Hoover tried to do, become in some ways the foundation of the future New Deal programs under Roosevelt. There was a great deal of dissatisfaction with the president, with the whole country. The Farmers Holiday Association begins destroying crops and pouring out milk with the hope that in some way they could drive the prices up. But the last thing you want to do in a time of a depression is to cut back on the food supply. And then the World War I veterans stood up and said, you know what? We're supposed to be getting our pensions, and we don't want to wait longer for our pensions. We want it now. And so they marched on Washington, camped out on the National Mall. They're called the Bonus Army because they wanted their bonuses. The result of this is that the U.S. Army had to actually be called out to remove U.S. veterans from the steps of the Capitol. And the worst of these things were Hoovervilles, that for the most part existed within urban parks. You had shacks and tin shacks, slums that were used in city parks throughout the country, Central Park, Chicago's Grant Park, urban parks throughout the city. And these Hoovervilles could be very, very dire places. Great view of a Hooverville is the movie Cinderella Man with Russell Crowe. You should watch that movie to understand what the Great Depression did to people. In this picture here, you see farmers actually pouring gallons upon gallons of milk onto the pavement, destroying it because they thought that this would drive up the prices and help them. The problem is no matter how high the price would be, people did not have the money to buy the milk anymore. Soup kitchens became the staple of the day, and you see here in this picture, people lined up to receive charity. How bad was the malnutrition of the Great Depression? At the time of the Second World War, 4 out of every 10 men eligible for military service were physically incapable of it due to malnutrition and being underweight. You see a caricature of Herbert Hoover saying, trust me, prosperity is right around the corner, and around the corner is a man throwing himself off a building after having lost his wealth. And that did happen. There were plenty of high finance people in Wall Street who lost everything, and they would throw themselves off of buildings. And last but not least in this lesson, you see the World War I bonus army camping out on the steps of the national Capitol, demanding the benefits they had been promised. No pay, all stay, they cheered.